Friends, it really is a delight and privilege to welcome you to Virginia Theological Seminary this evening, and a special warm welcome to those who've joined us on YouTube. It's lovely to have you with us too. My name's Ian Markham. I have the privilege of being the Dean and President here at Virginia Theological Seminary. And this work we're doing tonight is right at the heart of our mission. Just to remind you all, in the Lord's Prayer, which Episcopalians say at every liturgy, we have a petition where we say, "Thy kingdom come on earth as in heaven." And part of Christian faithfulness is to strive to bring about the reign of God on earth, to bring about a world where the values of the kingdom, the values of love and justice, are on earth as much as they are in heaven. Therefore, reflecting on the world where we live is not incidental to Christian faithfulness, but at its heart. Therefore, listening to a senator involved in the craft of the political, who is also a pastor involved in the life of a congregation, is an act of Christian faithfulness. This is the Lord's Prayer, and we are doing gospel work tonight. I do want to recognize some guests here tonight, and I'm going to start by inviting the descendants who are part of our program here at Virginia Theological Seminary to stand and be recognized. Please stand. To remind you all, our program is a commitment to recognize that this institution exploited the labor of those who served in this place in its past. And so we have a program where we reach out to descendants of those who were exploited, and we seek to be in relationship with them. And therefore, it truly is an honor that you're with us tonight. I am very aware we have friends from Alfred Street Baptist Church here, Trinity Methodist Church, and Christ Church Episcopal in the congregation, as well as many other alums and clergy. I'm not going to list you all, but I'm delighted you're all here. And finally, I want to thank the Reverend Dr. David Beckman, who is the Dean's Advisor for Political and Economic Justice, for organizing tonight's event. And I ask him now to come forward and introduce our speaker. Thank you, David.
Raphael Warnock is one of the two senators from Georgia. He's also still very active as pastor, senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. It was the church of where Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr. were senior pastors. I was part of a group of church leaders who went to see Senator Warnock in June about poverty issues in this year's Congress. I love the fact he told us that when he has speeches to give and staff write up notes for him to help him prepare, he instructs them to write at the bottom of each page in big bold letters, "Remain the Rev," remain the Rev, because he wants to be reminded that he's the Reverend first and a U.S. Senator second. Also in that meeting, then he counseled the church leaders who had come to talk to him about legislative issues. He said, "You know, we've really got to lean into God when we do policy work, so that it's clear that the church isn't always the meanest voice in the room." I won't forget that. So it's clear that the church is not always the meanest voice in the room. Raphael Warnock's mother grew up in coastal Georgia. She picked cotton and tobacco in the summertime. His father and his mother were both Pentecostal holiness preachers. You don't make much money doing that, and so His father, in order to provide for the family, also ran a salvage business. He salvaged parts from car wrecks. And then this book that you're being given tonight recounts how Raphael Warnock's closest brother, Keith, got into trouble and was convicted on a drug-related charge. Nobody got hurt, but he was sentenced to life at the age of 33. He was sentenced to life in prison. It's just clear to me, this man has got a Ph.D. in theology, but what's clear to me is he also has a life experience Ph.D. in the importance of racial and economic justice. When he won the January 2021 election in Georgia, it was a high-profile election, a really important election, and so it elevated his prominence in the minds of all Americans, many Americans, even more than before. And he has used this prominence to be a model of Christian faith in political life. As Dr. Martin Luther King did, as Archbishop Tutu did. He's a preacher who shows us that the love of God moves us to change the world, to be more consistent with the fact that God loves everybody. I invite you to join me in welcoming Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock.
Well, y'all stop clapping. I'm going to think I'm at a rally. Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you so very much. It's so wonderful to be here at Virginia Theological Seminary. Thank you for your kind invitation. It's always good to be back in the academy. And, you got to go back to the academy from time to time because the church will kill your brain. And you got to go to church because politics will kill your heart. And you got to stay in the streets unless you get disconnected from the people. So thank you so very much for this invitation. I'm grateful to the leadership of this seminary, to Dr. Ian Markham. Give him another great big round of applause. Thank you so much. To my friend who spent some time at my alma mater, Union Theological Seminary, Dr. David Beckham. Union alums in the house. And this will get me in trouble, but I noticed some of my clergy colleagues, the incomparable Dr. Jim Wallace is here, now at Georgetown. Good to see you, Jim. Give Jim Wallace. I have to be careful when I'm around Jim Wallace. He's always getting into some good trouble. And another person who's always getting in some good trouble, I have to be careful about being around her too. That's the Reverend Dr. Leslie Toon. And I'm grateful that one of my assistants from the church who was with me often, Reverend Bronson Elliott Woods, is also in the house. Will you give him a great big round of applause? Thank you so very much. In my new work, I don't get to do this that often. And so it's wonderful to be here. I want to thank, again, the leadership of this seminary for your vision and for bringing us together in this way. I want to talk about faith and politics at the crossroads of America. Faith and politics at the crossroads of America. How much time do I have? You know, preachers and politicians are loquacious of speech, and I'm both. I won't keep you here too long, I promise. So on January 5th, 2021, Georgia voters did an amazing thing. In a contentious and historic runoff election, they elected their first African-American senator and their first Jewish senator in one fell swoop. A state in the old Confederacy elected me and John Ossoff, African-American and a Jew, both of whom had spent time with John Lewis, one the son of a junk man and a preacher, the other the son of immigrants. And I think somewhere in glory, Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel were giving each other the high five. Because when they marched together. Rabbi Heschel said, when I marched alongside Dr. King, I felt like my legs were praying. We need praying legs. And I was feeling really good because my mother, who grew up in Waycross, Georgia, you know where that is? Waycross, Georgia. Picking somebody else's cotton and picking somebody else's tobacco had helped to pick her youngest son to be a United States Senator. And this is the great thing about America, and why I love this country, warts and all, because we always have a path to make America better. And I must admit that I was feeling pretty good that next day, feeling good that night. I knew I had arrived. I was on all the morning shows. I was on Good Morning America. I was on CBS This Morning. I was on Morning Joe. I knew I had arrived because I was on The View talking to Whoopi Goldberg. I was feeling good that morning. It was the morning of January 6th. I won on January 5th, woke up feeling pretty good on January 6th. But my victory lap was short-lived. By lunchtime, my phone began to buzz with alerts something terrible was happening at the Capitol building, and we all know what came next. In the early afternoon of January 6th, the other side of our complicated American family story emerged. All families have complicated stories. The other side, the ugly side of our story. 2,000 people descended upon the United States Capitol hoping to overturn election results that would certify Joe Biden as president of the United States. They breached perimeters, stormed the building, and assaulted some 140 Metropolitan and Capitol police officers. And outside, they built gallows with a noose and called for the hanging of Vice President Mike Pence. They desecrated the People's House, vandalizing and looting offices, breaking windows and furniture. They terrorized civil servants, staffers, and lawmakers who were forced to take shelter in undisclosed locations. The attacks led to the deaths, direct and indirect, of at least 9 people. Many of the folks who were engaged in that work were Christians, right? Attending somebody's church on a regular basis. And they were driven by what folks call the big lie, that the election had been stolen. But I submit that behind that lie was an even bigger lie. What was really being said was that this diverse American electorate, red, yellow, brown, black, and white, rich and poor, gay and straight, that this new diverse American electorate does not get to decide the future of the country. And observers and pundits of that fateful day often dismiss the mob as political and social outliers. They say that's not who we are. That's not our country. I submit that it feels good to say that, and we all want to believe it, but it's not really true. In a very real sense, January 6th is who we are. And it's who we've always been. But the good news is it's not our whole story. It's not all that we are. We are also January 5th, where a kid who grew up in public housing, one of 12 children in my family, clearly they read the Bible, be fruitful and multiply, 11 out of 12 first college graduate, can now be sitting in the United States Senate. We are both January 5th and January 6th. And now we come to this point where once again, the latest generation of Americans gets to decide which America we're going to be. I submit that is the tension, that's the fulcrum. And it is not just 2 opposing political visions, but 2 countervailing views of the Christian faith itself. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That's the American covenant. It echoes the scripture that says, out of one blood, God has made all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth. And yet God is not far from any one of us. For in God we live and move and have our being. It is the reason I do this work. It is for me spiritual work. It is moral work. It is the work that we're called to do in this moment. Because democracy is not just a political undertaking. I submit that democracy is the political enactment of a spiritual idea, this notion that all of us are children of God, that we have within us a spark of the divine, each of us. And if we have within ourselves a spark of the divine, then we ought to have a voice. And the way to have a voice is to have a vote in the direction of the country and your destiny within it. I believe that a vote is a kind of prayer for the world we desire for ourselves and for our children. I fight for the best of our democracy, for the broadening of the public space, which is quite literally the oldest definition of salvation in the ancient scriptures. Salvation, the broadening of communal space. I fight for that space because Reinhold Niebuhr was right that humankind's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but our capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. This experiment in democracy, so rare in the history of humankind. And here we are, somewhere between these 2 opposing political visions, these countervailing views of the Christian faith. And the truth is, we could lose our democracy. If we're not careful, we could lose the planet. We could lose our souls. So we must choose carefully with our whole selves, our minds, bodies, and souls, which path to take. And we need prophetic leaders and the leavening influence of a prophetic community if we are to redeem the soul of America. This has been the struggle in the American project since its inception. Who are we? Who will have a voice and who will not? And whose humanity will be affirmed? And so for me, somebody asked, why would a preacher get involved in something as messy as politics? They obviously have never been to a Baptist church. A good church meeting will get you ready for anything. Folks say to me all the time, how do you handle, so-and-so? I won't name any of my colleagues. Say, you should meet some of my deacons. Here we are, living in this tension. The tension between January 5th and January 6th. It is the American story in miniature. And much of it is animated by God talk, by theology. What I'm saying is that slavery would not have lasted so long were it not for the theology, complicity, and participation of the American churches. Segregation was also supported by the church, which Martin Luther King Jr. called the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday morning, the most segregated hour in America. And there is no MAGA movement or January 6th without huge segments of the American Christian church. Preaching they heard on Sunday morning or what they didn't hear placed them on the steps of that Capitol. And in that sense, the Jesus I know is the supreme victim of theological identity theft. And our project is to raise the Jesus of Luke 4, who said that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor in a country that so often in our public rhetoric maligns the poor, to open the eyes of the blind, to set the captives free in a nation that is the mass incarceration capital of the world. And as we try to do that work, that moral work, that spiritual work, we bring to the story of America our own stories, to that larger story. And my story is in many ways the story of the black church, for I am not a senator who used to be a pastor, but a pastor in the Senate. And I bring with me to the Senate and to the dialogue and debate about the future of the country the story of the black church. And let me hasten to say that when we say the black church, we have never, ever meant anything racially exclusive about that. In fact, the black church was born fighting not for exclusion, but for inclusion. It's a separatist institution of necessity, but it was literally born fighting for freedom. Born refusing to accept segregation in the house of God, refusing to worship in spaces where even communion was segregated. And so the black church, as I say in my book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Amazon.com, 24. Seriously, the black church was born fighting for freedom. That is our raison d'etre. And I submit to you that that is any Christian church that is truly Christian, its raison d'etre, its reason for being. The black church was born fighting for freedom, a freedom known in this world and in the next, a freedom of bodies and souls, a freedom from the slavery of sin and the sin of slavery, a freedom from the slavery of sin, kind of evangelical impulse, and the sin of slavery, liberationist tradition. And in many ways, ensuring that those two sides of the faith, the pietistic and the political, the social and the spiritual are not truncated, has been the task of the black church tradition among the American churches. The gospel means freedom, human freedom. The gospel means liberation. And while the black church itself does not always live up to that ideal, there is, as Gayrard Wilmore and others have pointed out, a kind of cohesive thread that runs throughout the history of the black church that emphasizes liberation born out of experience. And I lay that out in my book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, in 5 key moments, and I'd like to lay them out for you as we think about the moment that we live in. I talk about these 5 moments in which the church tradition that gave birth to me, that nurtured me, has been on an assignment in fighting against the heresy of trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. The first moment I talk about is the forging of a liberationist faith or Christianization. That is the invisible institution. That is the church, the black church before there was a church. That church that lived in the brush arbors of Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. Before the institution, slaves working out the faith in quiet and clandestine places. Al Rabbitoe said that slaves did not simply become Christians, they fashioned Christianity to fit their own peculiar experience of enslavement in America. They were not simply recipients, in other words, but they were agents in the fashioning of the faith. Howard Thurman said, by some amazing but vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. On Sunday morning, I put it this way: they gave us scraps and we made soul food. They gave us the blues and we made music. They gave us the Bible and pointed to Ephesians and said, slaves, obey your masters. We took that Bible and said, what about Exodus, where God told Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go? It's a faith informed both by the piety of the great American revivals and the politics of the American Revolution. Early on, the planters did not want the slaves to become Christian. They saw the dangerous implications of allowing slaves to become Christian. Yes. And the implications of the politics of the American Revolution itself. And this idea that you are a child of God, that's dangerous talk. Because if I'm a child of God, you might actually have to treat me like a child of God. And then the implications of fighting the British for freedom while engaging in your own tyranny. They saw the subversive potential in those two ideas separately and then put together. That's how slave rebellions happen. And so it became the task of a Christian slavocracy. And if ever there's been an oxymoron, there's one. It became the task of a Christian slavocracy to construct and maintain a distorted theology that kept internal freedom and external freedom, piety and protest wholly separate, while holding at bay the transformational implications of each for a people in bondage. And this was codified by the institutions of the church and the state. Here it is. Civic law. The lower house of Maryland asked the upper house in 1664 to draw up an act obliging Negroes to serve duranta vita for life, for prevention of the damage masters of such slaves must sustain by such slaves pretending to be christened, and so plead the law of England. Civic law. Church canon law, the Bishop of London opined, and so far is Christianity from discharging men from the duties of the station and condition in which it found them, that it lays them under stronger obligations to perform those duties. Not only from the fear of men, but from a sense of duty to God and the belief and expectation of a future account. Bishop of London. And so you're talking about a people caught between the machinations of church and state, both denying them of their humanity. Black Christians saw the contradiction, and you see it in their reading of, in the reading of Scripture, emphasis on Exodus. You see it in the witness and the practice of someone like Harriet Tubman, freedom fighter nurtured by the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, also known as the Freedom Church. You hear it in the spirituals. Theirs was clearly a decidedly different eschatological vision. That's why they're saying, I got shoes. You got shoes. All of God's children got shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes, shout all over God's heaven. Those who say that that is just a kind of otherworldliness don't really understand what's going on. It is a statement about God's economy. The way God sees us, it is both a vision of the future and a critique of the current condition. And if you have any doubt about it, just go to the next line where he says, heaven, heaven. Everybody talking about heaven. Critique of the slave master. Ain't a going there. The forging of a liberationist church, second moment. The founding, the forging of a liberationist faith, second moment. The founding of a liberationist church. So one of the slaves, they recorded slave testimonies in the 1930s, and let me just read one quote from one woman named Lucretia Alexander. She said, the preacher came and he'd just say, serve your masters, don't steal your master's turkeys, don't steal your master's chickens, don't steal your master's meat. Imagine hearing that every Sunday morning. Do whatsoever your master tell you. Same old thing she said all the time. My fathers would have church in dwelling houses and they had to whisper. Sometimes they would have church at his house. That was when they wanted to have a real meeting with some real preaching. And so in one sense, one definition of the founding of the black church was the effort of slaves to have a real meeting with some real preaching. And so one thinks of 19th century figures like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, Nathaniel Paul, Harvey Johnson. You think about bold preaching women like Joanna Lee and Sophie Murray and Harriet Felton Taylor and Amanda Berry Smith, who proclaimed their version of divine liberation without a license or ordination, dealing with sexist men. You think of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, of course, walking out, forming the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. You think of Andrew Bryan down in my hometown of Savannah, Georgia, founding the first African Baptist Church. Ebenezer Baptist Church is a part of that tradition, founded in 1886 on the heels of Reconstruction and the broken promises of Reconstruction. Ebenezer is a product of that tradition. And so was Martin Luther King Jr. He did not spring ex nihilo out of nothing and out of nowhere. He is a part of a tradition. And so the third moment is a liberationist movement, the fomenting of a liberationist movement. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, that is the spirit of the black church. Going out into the streets and the building of a multiracial, multi-faith movement for justice and human dignity. Martin Luther King Jr. rejected, as did his ancestors, this separation of body and soul, of spiritual concerns and material concerns. And he said the preacher must be concerned about the whole man, not merely his soul, but his body. It's all right to talk about heaven. He said, I talk about it because I believe in immortality, but you've got to talk about earth. It's all right to talk about white robes over yonder, but I want a suit and some shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about the streets flowing with milk and honey in heaven, but I want some food to eat down here. It's even all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day we must talk about the new Chicago, the new Atlanta, the new New York, the new America, and any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about the slums that cripple the souls, the economic conditions that stagnate the soul, and the city governments that may damn the soul is a dry, dead, do-nothing religion in need of new blood. And it is that sensibility that drove him and others to create then a multiracial movement to push the country closer toward its ideals, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Multiracial, multi-religious, a movement that had its martyrs. Not only Martin Luther King Jr., but Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, 2 Jews and an African American. Viola Luiso, a white woman from Michigan, married to a Teamster, came down fighting for the right of people to have a voice and lost her life in the process. James Reeb, preacher who had the nerve, the audacity to make his faith live in the movement. And lifting up the charter documents of the nation as Martin Luther King Jr. did, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which is why as I do my work, every now and then I like to go and visit the monuments. And I like to go to the Jefferson Monument and reflect on his words. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sublime words. But then when you look over from Jefferson's monument across the tidal basin, there's the monument of a black man standing there staring at Jefferson with his arms folded. Martin Luther King Jr. facing Jefferson as if to say, did you really mean what you said when you said what you said? King pushed us to think about what is the meaning of this American project. And he said it with an eloquence that endears us to King, an eloquence not only of words, but more importantly of deeds. He said, on sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship there? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? My friends, I think that one day our children and our grandchildren are going to rise up and ask us, where were we when the democracy itself was under assault? Did we show up in this moral moment? Finally, there was this fourth moment in the development of this liberationist tradition that gave birth to my own vision, and that is the emergence of black theology, which systematized all of this and asked in a way that was rigorous and academic, who's God? Who is their God? And what is it about the faith that allows the church so often to be on the wrong side, to be the meanest voice in the room? Maybe there's something about the faith itself that demands a deeper interrogation. And so it is these traditions that have informed my work. The emergence of womanist theology and the voices of LGBTQ voices also coming out of that tradition. The focus on environmental justice. And so I'm not a senator who used to be a pastor, but a pastor in the Senate informed by the values of my faith. But here's the thing, I do not foist upon the process of governing the creeds of my faith. I believe firmly in the separation of church and state. And I have no interest in living in a theocracy of any kind, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. And I worry about these folks. I'm afraid of these folks who follow somebody reading from 1 Corinthians. Standing in front of the church holding the Bible. While giving voice to some of the ugliest words in human history. What is it that is happening in our churches that allows that to happen? And so here we stand. Once again at the crossroads, the American crossroads between January 5th and January 6th. And all I'm trying to do in my own way is to give voice to the values of my faith. I'm not in love with politics, I'm in love with change. I put up with politics in order to do the work. This is not my first, when I was sworn in, that was not my first visit to the Capitol. I've been to the Capitol many times with troublemakers like Jim Wallace. When I came in 2017, I came fighting for Medicaid expansion, fighting for health care, because they were taking money away from the children's health care program while giving a tax cut to the richest of the richest of the rich. And I came with other clergy, and I began to say to the legislators who were there while standing in the rotunda of the Capitol building, standing in the rotunda, I began to say to them that a budget is not just a fiscal document, it's a moral document. Show me a nation's budget and I will show you its values. And if this budget were an EKG, it would suggest that America has a heart problem. Because you're not allowed to stand in the rotunda and sing and pray as we were doing, they listened to my speech and then they put me in handcuffs. They arrested me, but what they didn't understand is I didn't mind because I had already been arrested. My mind and my moral imagination had been arrested by this idea that we are better than this, that we could be closer towards our ideals. And so I continue that work. Different job, same project. And I return to my pulpit every Sunday morning to preach because I don't want to spend all of my time talking to politicians. I'm afraid I might accidentally become one. So there's this running train between the Capitol and the church, and between both of those places and the streets. And I just feel incredibly grateful that I get now to turn my protest into public policy, my agitation into legislation. Every now and then, you get to do something amazing. in the midst of the madness of Washington, every now and then I get to do something incredible like pass an expanded child tax credit, which would cut child poverty 40 to 50% in America. That's God's work. That's good news to the poor. I hope to make it permanent, because we only did it for 6 months. Every now and then you get to do something amazing. We've confirmed 150 judges. 2/3 of them are women and 2/3 of them are people of color. And had I not won, even with the president we have, had I not won, you would not have a black woman named Ketanji Brown Jackson sitting on the United States Supreme Court. Relief for farmers, student debt relief. And these days I'm working very hard to get a $35 cap on the cost of insulin for everybody, whether you have insurance or not, because I believe that health care is a human right. And the one in whose name I preach every Sunday spent so much time healing the sick. Insulin was invented 100 years ago. The patent was sold for $1. It should not be expensive. Somehow, somebody's got to ask the question whether you're in the Congress or you're serving as a citizen. What is it that we're called to do in this moment? How do we stand together in this moment that is so fraught and speak with one voice against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? You have to address them both. How do we pray with our lips and our legs, our head and our heart for a world that embraces the precious humanity and the promise of Israeli children and Palestinian children and Ukrainian children, that we might each see each other's children as we put our own children to bed each night? I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, my favorite job. And when I put them to sleep at night and say the prayers with them, I want them, and I want for all children, because in their eyes I see the eyes of all children. I want them to go to sleep in peace at night and awake to a future that embraces all of our children. And so in this moral moment, in this time of spiritual reckoning, which vision of the country will we embrace? And when our children and our grandchildren rise up and ask us, what were we doing? What did we say? How did we show up? I hope we'll be able to say, I gave it my all. I stood on the side of what's right, even when I couldn't see the victory in view. In closing, and nobody believes a Baptist preacher when he says in closing. I know it's dark, but the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness overcometh it not. I asked myself the night before I officiated the funeral of John Lewis, who was my parishioner, what were you thinking? I thought to myself, what was he thinking when he crossed that Edmund Pettus Bridge, knowing that on the other side of that bridge was brute force? Police officers with billy clubs. He had on a trench coat and a backpack, that's it. What was he thinking when he was crossing that bridge? Was he thinking that one day at the end of his life, the whole country would pause to view his funeral and 3 American presidents from both sides of the aisle would be there? No, he wasn't thinking that. Was he thinking that he'd be the recipient one day of the Presidential Medal of Freedom? I don't think he could have imagined that. I think John Lewis was just trying to stay alive that day so he could fight the next. Because change is slow. It comes and starts and fits. But by some stroke of grace, mingled with human resilience, he crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And while crossing that bridge, he built a bridge to the future and helped to move us a little bit closer to the beloved community. And now is our turn.
Senator Warnock's agreed to answer some questions. So I think the way we'll do this is on cards. And the ushers will bring cards, and you can just write your question and pass them back to the ushers. They'll also have some ballpoint pens if you don't have a pen. Am I right on that? Are the ushers around? Yep, there's one. And the ushers will bring the cards to Ian Markham. If you want to short circuit the process, you can take your card up directly to Ian if you don't. But he's got to be looking at the cards and seeing what are a number of people asking questions about, and then he'll give voice to the questions. And that's also a way to make sure that we actually get questions. If you open it up to questions, sometimes you get more commentary. So while they're doing that, Senator Warnock, I'd like to ask you a practical political question. In 2024, we're going to be making a choice between those two directions, those two visions of America. So people here like what you've got to say. For us, what advice do you give us about how we can make a real impact through the election process to move our country in the direction that we think the Lord wants us to move?
Yeah. So, even as a member of a political party here, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I think it's so important for you to show up. It's really, and I don't just mean show up to vote, but really show up and bring the faith that I've tried to lift up and before us again, bring that faith to the work. We are engaged in a full-on assault on our democracy. The forces at work on January 6th metastasized into literally hundreds of voter suppression bills and dozens of laws passed, metastasized into voter suppression laws throughout the body politic. In my own race in the last election that I won, I've had 5 elections in less than 3 years. And the last runoff, it is as if they saw my victory and they went after it with surgical precision. And they said on the first Saturday of the runoff, we can't have voting. We cannot have weekend voting the first Saturday of the runoff. And that's because there's a Georgia law that says you can't have voting on a Saturday 2 days after a holiday. They were talking about Thanksgiving and, listen, an old holiday that used to honor the birthday of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Can't even make this stuff up. And they said, to college students who could have come home to vote from college, sorry, our hands are tied. It's the clear reading of the law. You can't vote that Saturday. And since they said their hands were tied, I decided to free their hands. I sued them. And I won. And after I won, the folks who said their hands were tied then showed their hands and appealed the ruling. And I won again. And then they appealed the ruling, asking for emergency relief. And I won again. And so I had to go through all of that just so people could show up to vote. By the way, I won by about 100,000 votes. About 100,000 people voted that weekend. So the real goal of voter suppression is to so demoralize the electorate that you don't even bother. They're engaged in partisan and racial gerrymandering. And all, you say, well, what do you mean? What is this? Why are folks talking about voting rights? Because you just need to shave a little bit here, shave a little there. That's how it works. And so we've got to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We got to pass the Freedom to Vote Act. And we got to keep the vigil alive around those things. And so tell your friends who say it doesn't matter, are you kidding me? It's so very important in all the ways that involve responsible citizenship to show up.
Senator Warnock, the questions are coming in hard and fast. We're not going to get through all of them, but we will get through some. And we've got a group which are focusing on exactly why do you think we're experiencing an assault on our democracy, and what are the key drivers, and what is it that about the assault on the right, about the strangers who seek asylum in America, so linking it with the issue of immigration and migration. What do you think the drivers are of this assault on our democracy, and why has it become so acute at this time?
As disconcerting and concerning as this is, if you really think about it, perhaps we shouldn't be that surprised. Power doesn't, concedes nothing without a struggle. And I think, number one, it's a reflection of this emerging diverse electorate that can send somebody like me to the United States Senate. If you think people aren't going to rise up and that isn't going to make some people nervous, I think you're naive. And so I think people are seeing the ways in which the country is changing, and that makes some people nervous. Not just along racial lines, but a whole range of ways. And there are always demagogues who are eager, right, to exploit that fear for their own short-term political purposes. There are always demagogues, particularly in politics, who are saying, look over there, and while you're looking over there, they're taking your money. Which is why a lot of working class folks have historically in this country voted against their own interests by boogeyman politics. It's those folks over there who are taking your stuff. So here is what gives me hope. I remain hopeful because we've seen tough days before in our country. I knew John Lewis personally. He didn't give up. Who am I to give up? I remember watching my grandmother down in Waycross, Georgia, moving around in her garden one day, and we saw a snake. And, she's a country girl without even thinking about it a minute. She just, took an axe, cut off his head. One day I saw her wring the neck of a chicken. It's a terrible thing to see. She took that chicken's head off. And the thing that freaked me out was that when she took the head off, you know what happened? Chicken kept running. Snake kept writhing. In fact, moving more frenetically than it was before she hit it. And that made me nervous as a kid because I had no life experience and I didn't understand that the chicken was moving violently, not because it was living, but because it was dying. So the old order is dying. And we have to keep the faith and keep fighting for the highest and the best, a nation that embraces all of us.
Senator, thank you. I've highlighted two questions that focus on policy issues that some in the audience would like you to advocate for. The first is around guns and gun violence, which is the #1 cause of death for children. And what role can we play in pushing back on the narrative of some on the right who celebrate too much the gun culture? And the second is the autism community is still very much in the closet. We need a Keeping All Students Safe Act, and we need more measures to accommodate autistic Americans. Will you commit to championing such legislation and standing up to autism hate groups that are hiding in plain sight? Autism and guns, please.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the second part of the question, and I'll just quickly say yes. Whoever asked me that, will I champion the concerns of people who have autism and parents of children with autism and folks on the spectrum? The answer is yes. I'm committed to that work not only as a senator, but as a pastor. And actually, literally, about a month ago, I, as part of a series of sermons that I've been preaching, that I had been preaching on the family, I did a whole sermon on the goal of which was to push us as a community of faith to take seriously what it means to be the beloved community, a place that honors the gifts and graces of all of us. And what I saw, Reverend Toon, was that text in John where the man had been blind from birth. And they come to his parents and they ask and they say, yeah, this is our son. And thinking about that text in a different way, from the perspective of the disabled, from the perspective of folks on the spectrum, all of these needs. So anyway, I'm committed to that. On the piece around guns, we have had more mass shootings this year than we've had days this year. And folks who say to you, well, guns don't kill people, people kill people, should explain to us why we are the only country that's a wealthy country and there's not an active war going on that this happens. And so we've got work to do on that front. The good news is that in the 117th Congress, the last Congress, we did pass the first gun safety bill in 30 years. It's a bipartisan bill. It was modest, but it was meaningful, but clearly not enough. Too many mass killings, and we all know that. Here's the, I want to call it the good news, but it's good news. It's also the reason why we've got to work harder, and we've got to pass these laws that have to do with our democracy. In some ways, our gun problem is a democracy problem. Because the good news, actually, the question said, what are we going to do about those folks on the right who glorify guns? The truth is, our differences notwithstanding, there is more agreement among ordinary people on the left and the right on the gun issue than what's reflected in the laws that we've gotten passed so far. For example, according to a Fox News poll, you should mark this moment. You don't hear me say that often. According to a Fox News poll, 87% of Americans, 87%, believe that we ought to have universal background checks. And yet, there's no serious conversation about it in Congress. You would think that in a country as divided as ours, if you got 87% agreement on something, there has to be movement on that, and yet we can't even really get a real serious conversation about it going on in Congress. What does that tell you? It tells you, which is why I spent my talks and I spend so much time working on that. It's a democracy problem. The people's voices are increasingly being squeezed out of their democracy, and there's a growing disconnect between what the people want and what they're able to get out of their government. And so what we got to do is got to get the people their voices back. We got to deal with partisan and racial gerrymandering. The reason why you have extremists in Congress is because the only thing they're worried about is that somebody is going to run against them who's even more extreme. Right? The reproductive justice issue, we're seeing that folks who want to push a certain agenda are way out of line with the American people. For God's sake, you saw it in Kansas. So what we have is a democracy problem. And that's why we got to fight for our democracy and voting rights and against partisan and racial gerrymandering and against dark money in our politics. This is not just one issue alongside other issues. It is the very framework in which we get to fight for the things that matter.
Senator, we've got 6 questions on the theme of have you had conversations about your faith with members of Congress who take a different view of the faith? And what do you say if you've got friends and neighbors who are sympathetic to the Republican cause or to MAGA or to President Trump? And how do you interpret their understanding of the faith? So that's all grouped together.
Well, I've told you my interpretation of their, my thoughts on their interpretation of the faith. But the answer is yes. I talk to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and folks who share all kinds of perspectives on the faith and a whole range of subjects. And yes, I've been asked, by folks who don't share my politics to, please pray for me. And I'm like, yes, I will. You need a lot. I pray. And I try to build relationships and just get to know people as human beings. And every now and then, you will be surprised who you may be working with to get something done. John Kennedy is my partner right now in trying to get a $35 cap on insulin. I disagree with him probably 90% of the time, but we're working together on insulin. I've got several other Republican co-sponsors of that bill with me, both Republican senators, both senators from Alabama, Tuberville and Britt. and Braun and J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley. I'm working with all of them right now. Jim is scratching his head. See, this is why the Lord called me to do this. I'm working with all of them right now to get a cap on the cost of insulin. Because if you need insulin, you need insulin. And literally, I've been working with a young lady I got to know who, while in graduate school, was meeting people on Facebook in order to meet up with them in dimly lit parking lots to borrow insulin from people whose relatives had died. 1/4 of people with diabetes or who are on insulin, a full quarter, report rationing their insulin. And so, will I work with somebody with whom I disagree on a whole range of other things to get that done? Absolutely.
Senator, we have 3 questions on how do you alleviate poverty and other laudable policy goals in the light of the enormous debt that the United States of America is carrying?
We don't want to leave our country and our children with enormous debt. But what I have observed over the years is that the folks who are the loudest about this are often quite disingenuous. For example, there was an effort this week or last week to push forward a bill that said we will send aid to Israel, but what you've got to do is you've got to take out a provision in the Inflation Reduction Act which provides for us the IRS, the necessary personnel to keep the wealthiest of the wealthy from cheating on their taxes. And so every time you say taxes, people get nervous. And it's always funny to me because what I want to say to people in almost any room you're in, don't worry, when we say they're not talking about you. Most of us do not have those high-class problems. They send the IRS, we're not talking about you. So it would literally add billions of dollars to the debt. I forgot the number, I'm not going to make up a number. But it would add to the deficit. And that's being pushed forward by folks who say they're deficit hawks. We did a $2 trillion tax cut to the top 1%. Largely, they didn't even ask for it. And so I don't think we suffer from a paucity of resources. I think we suffer from a poverty of moral imagination. So I actually believe in tax cuts. And last year, we passed the largest tax cut, the largest middle class tax cut in American history for about 6 months. It was called the Expanded Child Tax Credit. That's my kind of tax cut.
We have the question, will you ever attempt to run for president? Feel free to announce it tonight.
Next question. Listen, I already have 2 jobs and 2 small children, So I'm pretty busy. Next question.
What did seminary teach you?
What did seminary teach me? No, I was going to say not much. I'm just kidding. I learned. No, I went to Union Theological Seminary. And no, I learned a lot in those places and in that space. I did 3 degrees there. I had incredible teachers. James Cone, James Melvin Washington, Phyllis Tribble. Oh my goodness. Great teachers, Christopher Morse. And I mean, they taught me how to apply, to think about my faith critically. How to interrogate, theology is faith-seeking understanding. I'm a trained academic theologian, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about the meaning of the faith. But I've always tried to do that in ways that make sense and show up in the real world. And during my time at Union, I had this running train between Union Theological Seminary, where I was studying, and Ebenezer Baptist Church, where I was on staff. And it was in the movement between Jerusalem and Athens, between ivory towers and ebony trenches, that my own sense of what ministry is took shape. And the first time I got arrested as a seminary student in an act of civil disobedience. There was a young man, an African immigrant by the name of Amadou Diallo, who was shot multiple times by a so-called elite unit of the NYPD while reaching for his own wallet on his own front porch. And while it shouldn't matter, he was very, very gifted, well-educated, spoke several languages, but he was just a black man with a black shadow holding something, and he lost his life that night. And many of us went in droves. New Yorkers went in droves to get arrested. I talk about that in my memoir, by the way, that you have, called New York State of Mind. And it was the first time I was arrested in an act of civil disobedience. We were responding to police brutality. That was in 1999. 1999. I thought about that when in 2020, I was running for the United States Senate. And I looked up, and there was yet this same movie, this same tragic drama that keeps happening. This time the name was George Floyd, with an officer on his knee on his neck. In the midst of that tragedy, and we were in the midst of the pandemic, and I saw a whole new generation of young people who weren't even around when I got arrested, responding to Amadou Diallo's tragic situation. A whole new generation, multiracial, masked to protect themselves from COVID-19. And they rolled out into the streets to fight another pandemic, COVID-19. Continuing to fight that battle. And in the midst of that, I was running for the United States Senate. And so I feel called to this moment, and I'm honored and inspired when I see these young people on the street standing up.
I'm conscious of time, so we might make, I think we better make this one the last one. And there are 3 questions on the theme of the changing nature of society, the fact that younger people are no longer going to church, a sort of disillusionment setting in with people who think the world should change a little faster than it does. What counsel, what advice would you have for people who are on the edge of church or alienated from church, and how can they find their way back?
It's something that I think about. I think the more the church is anxious about who's in the pews and who's not, and I get that, I get that impulse. I'm a pastor. And you walk out on Sunday morning, you've worked on your sermon, you hope somebody shows up. I get it. But I think I would counsel any seminarians who are here and headed the parish ministry or pastors, I think I would counsel you not to be so obsessed with that question. I think if you're obsessed with how to save the institution, the institution is going to be weak and you're going to lose the institution. Isn't that what Jesus said? If you seek to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you'll gain it. And so the best thing that the church can do for the world and for itself is to not be so obsessed with institutional matters and to give itself over to something larger than itself. That's what it means to follow Jesus. And that's what the civil rights movement was all about. It was about taking the faith into the streets and helping it to come alive. It's about the incarnation, the word made flesh and living among us. And so I try to remain focused on the work, both on people's spiritual formation, because I still believe in that, I do. But in the context of real human struggle and being honest about that. And what I see, in my own church is that young people don't so much join things. They're not joiners, but they do get engaged in movement. And maybe if people aren't hearing the gospel, maybe they're not hearing the gospel. St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel, and when necessary, use words. How about make your faith come alive in the public square?
I hope you'll stay for the reception. There's food and drink right out here. I think you have to go out this way, but there's food and drink in the foyer here. There's also food and drink in the atrium upstairs. That's a really pretty place. So I hope, and there are a lot of us that might, if you need a little space, we can go both places. But then, the main thing I want to focus on is getting pictures. Senator Warnock is really willing to try to have pictures taken with anybody who wants to, but we're a lot of folks, and we have an hour. So if you really don't care about whether you have a picture or not, skip it, and that'd be good. Or if you want to come as a couple and have your picture taken as a couple, or as a group, if there's a group, whatever we can do to move it along, so that. We love groups. Amen. Okay, and so he'll be here in the Flamingo, at the coffee shop here. And Nikki Burridge has agreed to take photos, and so you kind of move through fast and get your picture taken. And then it's up on Facebook, VTS Facebook on Saturday morning. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Really. Oh, wait a second, one more thing. I apologize. Joseph Thompson's going to close us with a blessing. Joe? No? Yeah, do. Please. Oh, okay. Just say a blessing.
Good evening, everybody. That's not just a description, it's not just a reading, it's also an apt description of the evening. It's been a very good evening, has it not? And an inspirational evening. So we just want to say how much we thank Senator Warnock for coming by this evening, sharing all of the many gifts that he has, and we pray that God will protect you and strengthen you for the good work that you are doing. And we say, glory to God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Glory to God from generation to generation in the church and in Christ Jesus forever and ever. Amen. Go in peace.